So some important disclaimers here. First of all, this is not an official consulting advice and may not be the bare minimum required to pass CMMC. We're providing examples for discussion purposes only. A lot of the opinions reflected in the presentation represent consensus opinion, but are not formal positions. Organizations should consider hiring experienced consultants to assist them with the nuances of various technologies. With respect to CMMC, the presentation is offered for general information purposes only. Nothing in this presentation constitutes legal advice. No attorney-client relationship exists, and you're advised to consult your own legal counsel on questions of the law. And it should be noted that this presentation may constitute attorney advertising under the Michigan and Illinois Rules of Professional Conduct. Inquiries concerning this material may be directed to the contact information listed. So just some brief introductions. My name is William Orlowitz, and I'm a principal at Relic Law PLLC. I'm a CMMC AB registered practitioner. My practice involves advising federal contractors on government cybersecurity requirements. These include DFARS 252, 204, 7012, and the CMMC. My clients include DIB contractors, manufacturing technology companies, and service providers. Nathan Regula, PhD, JD, is the president of Regula Cyber. He will be the principal speaker on today's call, leading you through the access control topics that we've selected. Nathan has over 10 years of experience at architecting complex cloud and big data systems while considering operational, business, and regulatory requirements. He holds a bachelor's in computer science and a master's and PhD in computer science and engineering from the University of Notre Dame. While working as a senior director and principal architect at one of the 3 largest U.S. prime contractors, Nathan earned a JD at George Washington University Law School, where he studied technology and government procurement law. Within the CMMC ecosystem, Nate holds a CCP, CCA, and PI credential, as well as being a member of the C3PAO Forum Board. So Nate is very well respected in the CMMC community and has a deep level of expertise on these topics. So Nate, why don't you kick us off here with just laying out some background assumptions about the topics we're going to talk about today.
Thanks, Will. And we had some prior webinars on this a few months ago, and obviously I'm sure we could re-record those. So we wanted to just cover some assumptions on scoping. Obviously, scoping is something on the consulting side extremely important, right? So you want to understand the scope of your information system, which is going to include people, process, and technology. So obviously everything we say here is going to be dependent on that scoping. Generally speaking, all the controls we're talking about today are going to get applied with very limited exception to essentially security protection assets. Under the current interpretation would probably not require FIPS validated crypto, but the proposed rule, if you've had a chance to look at it, it is essentially proposing FIPS for security protection assets. So that distinction will probably go away after the proposed rule is released if they retain that language. So essentially, most of the controls are going to get applied to CUI assets and SPAs. And CRMA, or the customer risk managed assets, are managed according to your risk process. So, we call out here as just a reminder to OSAs and OSCs that, you're defining what your risk management process is. So if you make your really hard, then you're going to have to do a lot of things and you're going to be assessed against that. That's not to say you shouldn't try to be as secure as you want to be, right? But from a compliance perspective, you can establish your risk management process as a fairly low bar and then implement what you want on the security side and not be in violation of your own goals. Specialized assets are assets that may or may not process, store, or transmit CUI. There's a couple subcategories here in the CMMC scoping guides. And some examples are government property, right? So if the government owns a laptop that they give a contractor, obviously you're not required to secure the government's laptop. In fact, you're not going to really have access to do that, right? So they're calling out the situations where there's special circumstances like this where you don't have control over the asset. Operational technology is another good example. So if you have, a CNC machine that makes parts, and originally in CMMC 1, there was discussion that those were, CUI assets if they are actually handling CUI, and they would be subject to all of the controls, right? Baselines, all of the hardening baselines, and so forth. And there was a lot of questions, rightly, from industry saying, well, some of this technology is millions of dollars. You can't necessarily put all of these settings in place. You're essentially going to immediately fail your assessment, but you can't potentially secure it. So how do you do that? So in CMMC 2, DoD said, okay, well, let's just, you have to write this up according to a risk management process, very limited assessment scope. So you no longer have to essentially document it to the same level of trying to meet 110 controls on things like CNC machines. So that's another example of a specialized asset. Obviously, high quality consultants should go through all this scoping in extraordinary detail. It's really important to get the scoping of your environment correct so that you can kind of maintain control and have success in your assessment and on the security side as well. So, and we are recapping it here just at a high level. So out of scope, there's really two ways to do that: logical or physical separation. Examples, probably the easiest, right? Physically separate networks. Clearly that's going to be out of scope if you have two separate physical networks. The logical examples, firewall rules, ACLs, and switches, VLANs are ways to logically separate things to make them out of scope. Diving into the first control here is authorized access control. And you really want to be looking at the assessment objectives from the CMMC assessment guide or the NIST Standard 171 Rev 2 assessment guide, right? Because if you're not looking at the assessment objectives, you're really not preparing your SSP and your organization for assessment. So that's why we're calling this out. So this language on the left is taken from the assessment guide. And you're going to see this pattern repeated throughout many of the controls. They're going to say something is identified, and then essentially, how do you do the thing that you've identified? And this is really getting at a cross check, right? If you authorize something, then how do you know that that thing that you've authorized is actually in place? So as an example, you're asking to identify authorized users. A typical way of accomplishing this is a list of authorized users. If you're a small organization, it may be as simple as an Excel list. You could have a payroll system of employees in the company and then rely on a list of approved contractor personnel. And so if you have your kind of payroll employees plus your list of authorized contractor personnel, that's the list of authorized users that could exist in your information system, right? And then when you get to the DEF, how do you know that the accounts, for example, in Active Directory are authorized? Well, if they're employees or contractors, then they would be authorized to have an account if that's the way your documentation was structured. You might ask is, well, could you just use Active Directory as your list if you've implemented Active Directory? And yeah, it depends, right? So yeah, theoretically you could. The questions you'll get from an assessor will be, well, if you have, for example, two system administrators with the ability to create, remove users, how do you know that, what is your source of truth to know if those system administrators abused their privileged access and created accounts that should not have existed because, for example, they're not employees or authorized contractor personnel? If you had a really sophisticated technology system, they have Fortune 50 and where there's software that has access to create and remove accounts, and there's a whole bunch of ticketing and process behind the creation of the accounts, and individual people don't have access to create and remove accounts individually in Active Directory, that would probably be a perfectly acceptable solution, right? And some very large companies do that. So, it's a question of context, right? And when the situation can be acceptable and when it can't. So the example here is illustrating the point. If you have, for example, an Excel list, a payroll system, and then your technology implementation, that's a very easy satisfaction of the requirement. If you're getting into the much more complex attempt of, well, we're just going to use Active Directory as the list of authorized users, it's probably going to require context. It's going to require more information to explain how you're accomplishing that. So we've tried to go on this kind of simple middle of the road versus the Fortune 50 with a $1 million access control system. But certainly those types of solutions are possible. For B here, list a process acting on behalf of authorized users. The simple thing that's asked here in almost all cases is the list of service accounts that are authorized to exist. You can also, of course, list local system service accounts for things like virus scanners and so forth that are running on endpoints. I did that, right? I think it just removes all doubt, right? If you have all of the local service accounts that are listed too, clearly nobody can object to what you've done. Inventory list of devices, obviously recommend as a best practice firmware versions, serial numbers, et cetera, that are enumerated in the inventory related controls. And then DEF focuses on how are you accomplishing this. I have an example right up here, right? It's a simple environment. If you used Azure Active Directory, you had single sign-on to all of your applications and components. Perhaps you have a conditional access policy that only permits authorized devices to connect to the information system. And then you kind of continue how you do that. And Azure Active Directory only allows authorized user accounts to the appropriate application or component. You have no service accounts. Obviously, this is a simple example. And then you can cross-check, right, the list of the devices enrolled in your MDM solution Intune against the list in C for your authorized devices. You can check your list of users that you have in A and C against the Active Directory. So we'll move on to the next control here. So transaction and function control. This is an area where obviously the OSC has some considerable flexibility. Obviously, it should align to what they're actually doing, but a simple example like this in a small organization. So system administrators are permitted to create, read, update, and delete configuration settings, right? Kind of enumerate Azure, O365, firewalls, endpoints, right? As approved by a CM ticket. So here you're tying it to your CM process, and then you enumerate what users are permitted to do, and then in B you're describing how you're implementing this on various components, right? So you might mention the different technologies and how if you're accomplishing something differently on, for example, Linux, Mac, and Windows, then you would describe what's different about your implementation on those various components. Obviously, you can break this up into other types of documents, but often in small organizations, I think it's easier just to put this stuff in the SSP directly versus having all these interrelated documents. So external connections is kind of an interesting one. So of course you see the identification again, and so I like to enumerate the external systems such as virus definition servers, patch sources, right? Partner company networks, network time servers, and then just list kind of a blanket internet access not blocked by security tools. Right? Personally owned phones would be another external system. And this is ultimately going to form the basis of your firewall rules. Likely, if you define them as obviously you're required to do, denied by default, permit by exception. What's permitted? Well, this stuff, certainly authorized external information systems would be permitted through your firewall. So this begins to form the basis of those controls as well. B is use, and so you're documenting the approval and identity. For example, personal phones onboarded to MAM after manager approval. C and E are essentially asking you to address how you enforce it. For example, this is the technical implementation, obviously saying that only BAM enrolled devices are allowed to access company email externally. And then the use of external systems is controlled limited. Firewall logs are reviewed monthly via the SIM to look for unexpected connection attempts or external systems to determine if policy changes are needed. And we just restate the other control here, that the firewall rules are denied by default and only allow authorized external connections as defined in A, which is the things that we've specifically allowed. So obviously, you can do administrative implementations, but it's going to become more difficult to explain how you're accomplishing those. COI flow is a bit related to the previous control. Our kind of sample here is that it's in an environment where you're controlling this technical means. You've got unencrypted CUI should only be flowing to CUI assets as listed in the inventory. So the example we have here is CUI stored in SharePoint with encryption and labeling. It may be accessed on company-owned endpoints and mobile devices managed by the information system. And what is the enforcement mechanism? We're saying that the sample here, the DLP solution, only permits the CUI to be accessed on devices defined in A, via FIPS validated TLS as defined in the O365 CRM, and then referencing which control in the CRM describes the O365 has FIPS validated TLS. So in C, they're talking about the source, right? Source and destination. So we're just describing that SharePoint is a designated source. You could also, and it's a destination. And then you would obviously say that your devices, right, are authorized source and destinations as appropriate. So it references that there's an authorization, right? So you could do that in the configuration management baseline document. You could do it in the SSP, saying that the company approves of the flow as defined. And also, via some SSPs will have an external connection section of the SSP where you can list, all the external connections to other information systems. And then it's enforced, right? So here, if you're doing an administrative policy, well, how are you going to enforce that? How are you managing that? Obviously, the technical solution is fairly easy. You're using a DLP solution, saying, well, it's via policy. It's not allowing the CUI to flow. Obviously, that assumes people have correctly labeled it and encrypted it, which you would make a policy. So least privilege. So, in a smaller organization, what we found works pretty well is you have an Excel table, right? If you go back to 3.1.1, your list of users, you just add columns, right? Privileged access to Azure Active Directory. You might have another column, privileged access to SIM data. Then you can set up groups for those if you're doing Active Directory to manage that. In B, so how are you doing it least privileged? Well, you assign the people that need that privileged access to the group. You're going to define security functions, right? An example of that would be access to the SIM data, or configuring the SIM would be an obvious security function. And then how are you accomplishing this with least privileged? Well, if all your systems are tied into Active Directory, using role-based access control, it's I think pretty easy to describe how you're accomplishing that. It's well understood if you're using RBAC with groups and you've tied people to groups, they're not going to be able to access things outside of the permissions they've been granted. So non-privileged account use. So this is obviously, up to the organization, but there is some, I would say, idea of what the government really wants here. And so you're going to define non-security function, right? This includes reading, updating, and deleting CUI and FCI, and viewing general purpose websites, right? So if you have, for example, using SharePoint to access CUI and FCI, you're not going to grant your administrative accounts access to that CUI and FCI, right? They don't have a purpose to access it in their administrative account. They're supposed to be, right, configuring the SIM and doing things like that. So, and then B, you're going to likely say that your access control policy and technical controls prevent the privileged users from accessing the FCI and CUI. And you might add a firewall rule that prevents the privileged users from accessing general purpose websites. So if your SIM administrator is logged in, they probably don't need to read, the news or Facebook, right? They probably just need to be accessing the SIM console and, perhaps government websites, right, that are describing vulnerabilities and indicators of compromise that they're going to be looking for. So privileged functions, similar to the previous one, where you're defining the roles and functions. I think if you've got an Excel list as an example of your users and roles, it's pretty easy just to incorporate this into there. So you have that kind of single, here's my list, right? I've identified users, roles, privileges, right? All in a single document. So a non-privileged user, right, is they're not going to have checks in the columns that define privileged functions. And then in C, say something like, your endpoint and server hardening prevents non-privileged users from accessing privileged functions. This is kind of an area where, while you're not required to use super stringent hardening guides, the more rigorous hardening guides you have, it's going to be easier to demonstrate this, because those hardening standards are going to incorporate a lot of technical controls that are going to require privileged authentication to do privileged functions. So it's going to kind of give you a lot of this enabled on the endpoint, so to speak, because you've implemented the rigorous hardening standards. And then that also applies to D. So, for example, the hardening guides for Windows, right, are going to adjust the logging settings for lots of things, and that's going to enable you to show that you have successful and unsuccessful attempts to carry out privileged functions being logged. And the example here is, right, that your hardening is going to enable logging for attempts, whether they're successful or unsuccessful, and then you're probably going to reference here that see CM baselines for details by components, especially if you're using multiple operating systems for your endpoints and servers, plus a firewall, for example. You're going to have a reasonable number of items there. So session termination, it's a OSC defined. It's typically looking for things like, if you have a VPN, what's your VPN session timeout? I would list other components as well. In the SSP, if the organization is small enough, right, your administrative console for your firewall, you have a two-factor solution, right? You probably want to list the timeout that you have configured in that. The kind of core security protection assets, and then how are you doing that? Well, if you've implemented it in the technology, obviously you're going to be able to show the configuration, the screenshot of that technical configuration to show how that's happening. Remote access. And so this is a fun one. There is some, I would say, divergence of opinion in the community. So remote certainly covers over the internet. It also covers over the network, depending on the control. So if you're using a SaaS provider, you want to authorize access to the SaaS provider formally in the external connection. Additionally, access via remote VPN is still technically remote, and so you would list that as permitted. And this is where you can see kind of there's a pretty significant paperwork burden, right? So if you're a small organization, there's a lot to document. In B, the types of permitted remote access. So we have here, defined privileged access is permitted. For example, you're essentially you're not at the cloud provider, right? So you're not sitting at the servers the cloud provider has. Right? You're going to be accessing their administrative portals over the internet. And if you have a VPN, you're going to be accessing things over the VPN, privileged and non-privileged. And so for controlled, here I have the example is all remote access sessions, whether VPN or leaving the IS and going into the SaaS provider, are logged and monitored by X, right? Where X is going to be your access control point if you've implemented a central access control point. And then monitored, right? You can reference that since you have the logs, right? And you've ideally set up, SIM alerts. If you have a SIM, then it's pretty easy to show D that since you have these logs, they're going to trigger alerts. And then, for example, you might do a quarterly review of the types of traffic flows, right? So there are applications and SaaS providers that are not consistent with the policy and business need, right? People trying to access something because they have a business need and it's not permitted, that might be an opportunity to add that, right, to the permitted external system, change your firewall role. Obviously, you'd likely do a CM ticket for that. So remote access confidentiality, they're asking you to define the cryptographic encryption and hashing algorithms that are used for remote access. This is ultimately going to tie back to FIPS and the SC controls. So I would just recommend mentioning the FIPS certificates here as well. So for example, if you've got a VPN, you're going to define whether that's IPsec or TLS. You're going to reference the algorithms, the strength of AES, the hashing algorithm, and so forth. As we noted at the beginning of the presentation, there's in the proposed rule, there's certainly the expectation that they're going to require FIPS for security protection data, in addition to CUI. So it's really putting FIPS on SPAs, CUI, and it's going to, if you have a VPN, it's going to be very difficult to say that your VPN doesn't need to be FIPS validated. And so how are you enforcing this? Likely a VPN device setting, O365 and browser settings for TLS if you're using O365. So remote access routing, this is kind of a fun one. So they ask you to define the managed access control points. And the example here that's I would say certainly going to be fine for assessment is, you've got a central firewall or firewalls hosted at a cloud provider at an authorized data center, and you tunnel all the traffic there. And the only traffic, obviously you have a VPN, so for example, on a phone, on a laptop, the VPN itself is going to have to connect to those central locations, but all of the traffic going to the internet is going to pass through your access control point and then go out to the SaaS or other external service. So clearly that's going to be fine. There is some discussion around the use of endpoint only firewalls. So under this control, you can arguably do that, right? You can say your external boundary is the boundary of the endpoint, and that's managed access control point. That kind of cuts against the discussion, right? Because the discussion talks about having a small number of central access control points to, minimize the kind of external boundary exposure and incident response ability, right? So people are working at home, they're going to have a bunch of IP addresses, right? And that's cutting against the idea that you have small access control points. You've heard of the government's TICs, right? The Trusted Internet Centers, right? They have small access control points, small number of them, so they know whether the traffic's the government's or not the government's, and they have a bunch of security tools there. So if you do endpoint only, to me it raises the question of, yes, under this control you can argue that, but when you get to things like split tunneling, audit logging, do you have the audit logs from all of your endpoints? Are those audit logs in your SIM, right? If they're not in your SIM, then it complicates your incident response, and the ability to correlate your logs. So there's a lot to work out because all the controls are related if you take the position of, endpoint only firewalls. So that's my cautionary tale there. I would also add, I think, companies would be wise to think about what other commitments they've made, right? Insurance companies, prime contractors, right? If the prime expects that you have, a smart firewall at your managed access control point, logging and monitoring everything, by all means, right? The endpoint only stuff is a great technology. It's just an addition. If your insurance company thinks you have a smart firewall in the center and you don't, then you have a different idea of an implementation of what the insurance company has. That's probably not ideal. So I think hopefully DoD will clarify this at some point. I think the government's intent is, central managed access control points, VPNs, right? That's what FedRAMP providers are doing. That's what the government's doing. That's what large primes are doing. So, but I certainly, having implemented this stuff, I hear the cost and complexity side of it too. But that's just a cautionary tale. This is one of the more controversial ones. So wireless access authorization. So of course we see the identification and then it's authorized in B. So of course, if you have, an inventory, for example, in Excel or some other tool, you can note, right, whether the thing is a wireless access point. And then, presumably, if you have wireless access points, you're going to have a configuration management baseline for those access points. You're going to have tickets, right, for adding them to your information system. Your SSP and other policies are going to cover what the access points are allowed to do. And B is really focused on the paper trail, right, before they're used, right? That folks just aren't going to the store and buying access points and plugging them in, that there's got to be configuration baselines there's got to be, some sort of paper trail ticket that shows, serial number 1, 2, and 3 were authorized to be access points for the network, and then they were onboarded. And obviously, if you don't have them, I just generally write that in the SSP, right? Or just say that the company does not authorize wireless access points and has no wireless access points. However, it would require CM baselines and CM tickets for any future use and updates to the SSP and associated policy and procedures. And then our policy essentially says we don't have access points, but we would require them to be, hardened and so forth if we ever established them. So this one, obviously, if you don't have wireless access points, you're going to have a similar write-up here. But if you do have them, you want to look at your data flow diagrams very carefully and be able to articulate to the assessors whether you've got CUI or if the proposed rule takes effect, requiring FIPS for security protection data. If you've got security protection data flowing over the wireless access, then likely you're going to need FIPS validated wireless. And so that's where your data flow diagrams are really going to be important. If you've already got FIPS encryption on your, for example, remote access to security protection devices, and CUI is already encrypted with FIPS validated encryption, you are in a better position to argue that you don't need FIPS for the wireless. You're just going to want to be careful that you can articulate how having access to the wireless doesn't give somebody special privileges inside of your network. For example, be treated as a trusted source, because I think you're going to face some scrutiny on that. But you would define the type of encryption and describe that. Obviously, if you've got FIPS certificates, I would list them here to make it easier for everyone. And if you're using the VPN for all users, right, then you can generally descope the wireless outside of your information system. Obviously, you don't want it to be part of the information system. But for example, if the facility has guest wireless and people are VPNing, then them sitting at the on the guest wireless is similar to them being at home, VPNing everything. So you can descope wireless in that way from the information system. If you don't have FIPS validated devices and you don't want to get them and you don't want to manage them as part of the CMMC information system. Obviously, that then assumes you've done the scoping correctly, the logical separation options in the early slide. So mobile device connection is largely focused on phones. Obviously, there's going to be similar requirements for laptops, right? But when we focus on phones, devices are in a managed inventory, right? So how do you know, essentially who's authorized to have their phone, right? Where's that inventory? Where's that authorization? You might say in B that the devices are authorized by management for inclusion into the corporate MDM solutions. You might have a ticketing process. You might have emails, right? Depending on the size of your organization, what's the process? And then you might say if you've established the central internet monitoring location that requires VPN, then in C you can very simply say, well, you route the traffic via remote access VPN to the managed access control point when the traffic is going to get monitored and logged. And then if you're using endpoint level tools, then obviously that's just an additional write-up that you should add here that that you have that as well. Encrypting CUI on mobile. So obviously your assets for CMMC purposes have to have an asset category like a CUI asset. So here they're obviously focused on the CUI mobile devices. So if users are reading CUI, writing CUI emails on their, for example, mobile phone, if you have the appropriate encryption on that device if it's stolen. So obviously these devices are going to be listed in the inventory as a CUI device. And then what is the approach to encryption on that? So I would recommend something like the following FIPS certificates are used for iOS and Android devices respectively. And then these are obviously sample very old FIPS certificate numbers. You would locate an appropriate FIPS certificate number. Obviously you want to be careful with iOS and Android. They change versions very often. Obviously the FIPS certificates, NIST has a huge backlog of approving FIPS certificates. So you want to make sure that you have a valid FIPS certificate on the version. For example, iOS 15, for example, I don't think there is a FIPS certificate for iOS 15 yet, for any version of iOS 15. So if a FIPS certificate issues for iOS 15, say 15.4, obviously we're not using 15.4 today. Apple releases updates every month or two for the older versions. You would likely want to have an internal POAM and say, well, Apple sent version 15.4 to the FIPS lab. If we ran that, there'd probably be a bunch of critical vulnerabilities, right? Apple has patched security problems. So we're running 15.8. And we are looking at the release notes, and Apple's not saying that they changed anything related to crypto. So we are accepting the risk that we had to patch from 15.4 to 15.8 to stay up to date with our vulnerabilities. And we're technically not running the version of iOS that Apple sent for FIPS certification, because did, right? They only send one version every release. So nobody would be running the version that was officially sent for the lab. And that's quite common. And assessors are likely to be okay with that. But what you want to be careful of is if Apple has a FIPS certificate for iOS 12 and you're running iOS 18, you now have a huge major version change, right? So iOS 18 is not generally covered by the FIPS certificate for iOS 12. So hopefully NIST solves the backlog relatively soon. It's I think quite frustrating to a lot of people that so many people are reliant upon it now with the emergence of CMMC assessments. But there's these kind of core pieces of technology are not getting listed with FIPS certificates nearly as quickly as the vendors are innovating and releasing new versions. But be super careful from an assessment perspective with that. And if there is no FIPS certificate, certainly I would recommend that you have a POAM on that and say, well, look, these devices don't run anything lower than iOS 18. We don't have a FIPS certificate, but we trust that Apple's going to submit it for FIPS certification. They've submitted every version in the past 10 years. Not just picking on Apple, right? I mean, the same logic is going to apply to other vendors as well. But definitely be careful with that. Portable storage use. So obviously, this is important because people could grab a flash drive. The concern is right off the road, and it has malware on it. They stick it into a device, or they have a flash drive with CUI and it goes missing, right? So how are you controlling portable storage devices? So once again, we of course see the identified and documented the idea of an inventory. You might also say that you just prohibit them completely. So you could say something like our DLP rules control removable media, or our DLP rules completely block removable media. So like many controls, you can use administrative policy, but obviously be prepared to defend how you're effectively managing that. If you've got a 5,000 person organization, you're saying, yeah, we're just using directives for managers to effectively control removable media. You certainly want to have a good argument of how you validate that. For C, so if you're using a technical implementation, right, proving this is pretty trivial. Say your roles enforce the policy via technical means so that only authorized privileged users can adjust the DLP rules via an approved CM ticket. For example, you might allow whitelisted storage devices that have been procured and onboarded by the company, or you might just prohibit them completely so that if someone sticks a USB drive in, it's just going to give them a message that you're not permitted to use removable media. And that is the last control slide.
Okay, thank you, Nathan, for that very informative rundown of some of the more challenging access control requirements. At this time, we've got quite a bit of time left for questions and answer for Q&A. And I know we have at least one question in the chat But if others have questions, please also add them to the chat, and Nathan and I can help answer them at this time. I guess, Nate, let's take the first one that was posted, which is for practice 3.1.1, recommendations for systems processes that process data but not associated to an authorized user, i.e. cron job, et cetera. Do you tie/associate all processes to a user?
Yeah, so I certainly understand the question. I was personally a bit frustrated by this scenario when documenting things. So what the control, I think, wants everyone to do is essentially tie it to a person, like an administrator that's authorized it. So maybe it's running as the root account on a Linux system, and you essentially say the cron job is running at root because it's has access to all the files and it needs to back things up, for example, or maybe it's running a virus scan, and so it has to be run as root, and then I would list that as authorized by the system administrator of that system, or whatever. For example, if you have a CM ticket that authorized that on behalf of the system administrator for that system, and that way you can essentially, which person can explain and articulate why that job is there, and I think that's really what they're getting at.
Okay. We have another question. This is a little bit higher level. What exactly does CMMC do? Nate, I don't know if you want to just point them, the attendee, to some resources where they can learn more about CMMC and what its intended purposes are, but that might be helpful.
Sure, I'm sure we can. So that if we do a Google search for the DoD CMMC program, I'll just very briefly. So it's not really intended to be different than NIST Standard 171 in terms of the security requirements. I think there's a little caveat to that on scoping. CMMC really codifies those scoping categories in the early slides, and that's where I think CMMC is a little bit different than NIST Standard 171 on the requirements, but essentially where they're applied, and so it's really intended for at this point the DoD to understand that the contractors are actually implementing NIST Standard 171 as the government expects, because there's been kind of self certification for quite a number of years.
Excellent. And Catherine also, she dropped a link in the chat with some useful information attached to it, so they can access that. Any other questions from those in attendance today? I know the material can be a bit complicated, especially when you start to look at sort of unique setups. So if you have questions that you need perhaps more time to prepare, feel free to put those together, and then you can send them to us. We're going to share our contact information shortly.
Yes, I did get some anonymous questions, which I can take. So the question is, what about a company that vets people at hiring time and then kind of gives broad access to CUI? So certainly if the vetting is going to meet the requirements of Standard 171 CMMC, that's certainly good, right? You can at least say that the vetting meets the organizational requirements and the if they're determined to be meeting the legal requirements for access to CUI. But I think the challenge from an assessment perspective is, if everyone doesn't need access to CUI, it's, I think assessors are going to ask on the access control side, well, what sort of scrutiny is there to ensure that only the people that need access to CUI have access, and it's not a need to know program, right? It's not classified, but there is a business need, right? A valid government purpose to the CUI. So I think that's where the organization is gonna face questions. If for example, there's 1,000-person company and 1,000 people have access to the CUI, well, are 1,000 people actually working with the CUI? So there's a few more questions here. So if we've been looking at platforms that are Windows only to help limit the security domain and keep CUI private. So essentially, can you recommend any cross-platform systems, and do you feel these purpose-built platforms are even necessary? So I think the question is really about kind of keeping CUI, if I'm understanding the question, either encrypted or just keeping it out of the kind of general purpose file share type scenario, but more of a purpose-built tool to protect the CUI, whether it's through encryption or other means. I think some of the tools that they're kind of designed for sharing of CUI or other sensitive data can be important in sort of enclave environments where, if the whole company is not dealing with CUI, they may not want to, for example, deploy GCC High. GCC High is a powerful product, but it requires a lot of work. And obviously, we're not endorsing or recommending any specific product. Just make that disclaimer. But GCC High is often discussed in the community. You obviously have to migrate to it, and you have to configure a bunch of stuff. So if the organization doesn't want to do that, and if that investment doesn't make sense, then some of the tools that are designed to, for example, encrypt CUI and make it shareable with specific external parties can be really powerful, because they can run that software on top of their existing environment as long as they've appropriately kind of secured the endpoints, and they don't have to migrate their whole company to something like GCC High. So I do think there's a place for those platforms. Unfortunately, it still requires work, because the endpoints are still going to be in scope. If the endpoints, for example, have CUI, the endpoints are still in scope, and that's going to bring in the SIM and the virus scanning tools and stuff like that. This is a question about hiring an auditor and consulting firm before purchasing anything or starting down the CMMC compliance path. I mean, small companies can do it. I think it's a question of the amount of time and resource that people want to devote to becoming really well versed in it. I think for a lot of organizations, it's going to make more sense for them to engage consultants, right, or candidate C3POs, because just the amount of interconnection between the requirements and the documentation that is required to pass an assessment is quite significant. So they're not trying to dissuade people, but I think an example is, I think our SSP was over 270 pages. And that's not all of the documentation, right? And it's not everything. So there's a great deal of effort that is required beyond the technology implementation. So for a lot of organizations, I think the consultants will just kind of outsource some of that to an extent, right? And it will, if you want to add thoughts to that.
Yeah, actually, Nate, I want to direct you to a good question from the audience here, which is, what difficulties might organizations face in meeting the requirements of AC 3.1.19 encrypt CUI?
Sure. So I'm just going to make sure if we're referring to the at rest or in transit encryption. The advantage, obviously, and it's certainly going that direction in all the requirements, is that using a FedRAMP provider or FedRAMP moderate equivalent provider, they are almost certainly going to provide FIPS validated encryption in transit and at rest, because that's a core requirement of FedRAMP. So that's a piece of it. The challenge, I think, so assuming organizations are using those providers, the challenge is not at the cloud provider, but it's in the infrastructure that they own and manage. For example, endpoints. One of the big ones, just from a compliance perspective, is the kind of example I mentioned with mobile phones, right? So if there's no FIPS certificate it's quite a problem, because from a compliance perspective, you're not technically compliant, right? So there's no FIPS certificate, you're not compliant. So what do, right? You either disable the phones completely, or you have a POAM that says, well, we don't have a FIPS certificate, and we expect, NIST to issue one at some point after the vendors and NIST haven't worked out. In most cases, right, the vendors have submitted the stuff, they've probably passed their lab validation, and it's waiting in a giant queue because they're listed on the modules and process list at NIST. So I think the NIST backlog is quite a big hurdle. Obviously, when you're dealing with phones, you end up with the degree of control that the organization has over the phone, especially if they're CUI devices. So is the company going to own the phone? Or are you going to permit BYOD, and are users comfortable having the company be able to wipe the apps or wipe the phones, depending on whether they're using MDM or MAM? VPN, right, can cause battery use, right? Security tools that you run on the phone can cause battery use. So I mean, there's certainly a lot of kind of administrative concerns there, right? If can you find something that's FIPS validated? There's obviously third-party software and tools if you're using MAM. The phones themselves are reliant on the vendors working with NIST, and NIST issuing the certificates in a timely fashion. So I think those are the main challenges.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. Anything else from our side that we would want to add here before we part ways? Okay.
The next slide, perhaps.
Yeah. We'll share our contact information here. And also want to invite everyone who attended today to our second of 3 webinars. We're going to be focusing on Wednesday, July 10th at 1 p.m. on incident response, which is a topic that maybe seems simplistic based on the number of practices devoted to it, but has some interesting caveats and implications to the extent that the requirements are ever invoked. So hope you come out and join us for that one. We'll try to impart some additional workshop style information that you can take back and make actionable within your own organizations. And again, if you have questions for either Nathan or myself, we can be reached at the email addresses below. Happy to answer one-off questions that concern these topics, and hopefully can assist you in your CMMC readiness journey. So thanks again for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on July 10th.